Hi there, folks. My name is Kate Salamito, and I'm the Experiential Learning Coordinator at the Irving Institute. And I am welcoming you today to the third session of Energy 101, Fossil Fuels and Their Social and Environmental Implications. And with that, I'll hand it off to John, who can introduce himself.
First of all, I wanted to thank Stephanie and Kate and Amanda and Elizabeth and everybody at the Irving Institute for making this possible. I'm really, and all of you for your interest in joining us tonight. I'm really excited about the opportunity to share some of the insight and knowledge I have on global fossil fuels. So let me get straight to sharing my screen here. And so again, really happy to be here. What I'm hoping to accomplish tonight is to first provide kind of a basic overview of fossil fuels and how they fit into today's global energy landscape. Also give some perspective on how and why the world became so dependent on fossil fuels, how and why. Talk about some of the downsides of fossil fuels, particularly their contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Then share some insights into the geopolitics of fossil fuels as a backdrop for understanding how major nations and blocks of nations are approaching energy transition, and save some time for Q&A at the end, where you can ask me anything. We'll incorporate some questions along the way, but as I told Stephanie, I am more than happy to stay after the 8 o'clock and answer questions and discuss with folks that are interested in staying on longer. A little bit about me. I grew up in the Rust Belt in the Lehigh Valley of Eastern Pennsylvania, which at the time I was growing up was kind of the heart of the steel industry and the cement industry and a lot of other extractive and not terribly clean businesses. Came to Dartmouth, graduated in 1985 as an earth science major. That's my student ID on the right there, and I'm still amazed that we put on a jacket and tie to get our ID pictures taken back then. I went on from Dartmouth to get a master's in geology and geophysics at Rice University, and then spent 30 years in the upstream petroleum industry with three main employers. When I left graduate school, I started with Mobil Oil Corporation, working in international exploration and production, primarily in Southeast Asia and Africa. I left them in 2000 and went to work for Schlumberger, who is an oil field technology and services company, and then spent the last decade with Southwestern Energy, who was one of the pioneering companies in development of shale gas in the United States. I left them earlier this year, and I'm currently self-employed, working as an advisor to startups and a mentor to entrepreneurs, and do a lot of consulting to corporate clients on strategy and innovation, both in the energy industry and beyond. The picture on the bottom there is my family. So I have a 17-year-old daughter who's a senior in high school, and my wife who's also a geoscientist. So let's start off with just a little grounding on world fossil fuels. The country of Qatar is one of the Persian Gulf states. They are one of the largest producers and exporters of natural gas in the world, and probably not too surprising that a small, wealthy nation like that might have the highest per capita energy consumption in the world. They consume a lot of energy just in the production and processing of natural gas. And then they sit in the Persian Gulf where, you know, the daily temperatures exceed 40 degrees C most of the year. They're a very modern, high standard of living, lots of electricity generated for air conditioning and things like that. So not terribly surprising they have the largest per capita energy consumption in the world. But I'd be curious if, you know, they're a little bit of a special case. Which country do you think consumes the second most total energy per capita in the world? So we'll put up a poll here and you can answer. Okay, so the results are in, and it looks like the majority of the group made a very logical and reasonable guess of the United States. But let me show you what the actual answer is. The second highest per capita energy consumption in the world is Iceland. And you may say, well, that's strange. Iceland, I thought they were one of, I never thought of them as a large energy consuming country. And you can see that they are up at 180,000 kilowatts per hour per citizen, almost as high as Qatar, and actually more than twice what the United States consumes per capita. So what gives? Well, Iceland is an interesting country. They were very energy poor in the 19th century. It's a country that basically, subsistence living. Their main industries were fishing, sheep herding, and agriculture. In the 1800s, they actually had problems with crop failures and disease, some of it driven by volcanic eruptions. The island had become largely deforested through the preceding years as people cut firewood for energy, and then the volcanic eruptions took care of the rest. So they became heavily reliant on imported coal and later oil for energy. And that continued really through the Second World War. But late in the 20th century, the country made a strategic decision to develop its hydroelectric and geothermal resources. The country now uses about 85% renewable energy for heat and electricity, and only about 15% of their needs are met by fossil fuels, and that's almost exclusively for transportation. They enjoy a very high standard of living, sixth highest in the world, high per capita GDP, and they have very high household energy use for both for heat and light. Obviously, the most of the year in Iceland is heating season, and for much of the year, daylight hours are fairly short. But they also are home to two very energy intensive industries. One sort of traditional old industry, which is aluminum smelting, which is done using electricity. And the modern one is cryptocurrency mining, which is fairly electrically intensive as well. In fact, I was stunned to find out that they actually use more electricity for cryptocurrency mining than they do for household energy use. So the question is, why does Iceland use so much energy? And the reason is they use so much because they have so much. The geothermal and hydroelectric energy are abundant. Once the investments were made to put them in place, they became very affordable, and they became strategic for Iceland. They eliminated their dependence almost completely on imported sources, and it allowed them to develop industries that they didn't previously have. So you may be asking, we're here to talk about fossil fuels. Why are you talking about Iceland? And I really just wanted to put it out there because the reasons that Iceland uses a lot of energy, it happens to be renewable energy, really aren't that much different from why the rest of the world uses so much fossil energy. So let's talk a little bit about fossil fuels. What are fossil fuels? Well, they're preserved biomass from the past. They're, in the case of coal, it's terrestrial plant material, leaves and wood. And in the case of oil and gas, it's mainly marine algae and plankton that have been buried in sedimentary rocks, and through time, burial and temperature and pressure, convert into coal, oil, and gas. They're concentrated in specific geologic settings in time and space, and the map to the right shows some of the major oil and gas fields of the Eastern Hemisphere. They're produced generally by mining or drilling, coal and oil sands by mining, and most of the oil and natural gas by drilling. They have very high energy density, meaning the amount of energy per pound or per unit of volume is quite high. And we release this energy by burning them. So they're combusted to yield thermal energy, heat, which releases, in addition to heat, carbon dioxide and water vapor as the primary products of combustion, along with other pollutants like nitrous and sulfurous oxides, particularly with coal and oil. And fossil fuels today supply about 80% of the world's primary energy. The chart on the left shows recent trends up until 2019, as shown in the BP Statistical Review of World Energy. The green, red, and gray are oil, gas, and coal. And the little small sliver at the top is everything else, nuclear, hydro, renewables, biofuels don't even show up on this one, I don't think. So if we look at the Sankey diagram, this is from the US, and I discovered something really interesting. The US consumption is just about 100 quads right on the nose in 2019, which makes the math really easy. If you look up the left-hand column, primary use petroleum, which is oil, is about 36% of US primary consumption, coal's about 11%, and natural gas is about 32%. So collectively, about 80% of the primary energy consumed in the United States today is fossil fuel. And that's about the same as the global numbers. And if you look at electricity generation, about 2/3, about 60% of electricity in the United States is generated from fossil fuels as well. So I guess the question is, how did we become so dependent on fossil fuels? We, the United States, and really we, the world. And I want to take you on a brief journey. This is something I put together over the last week or so, a brief journey of energy transition through time. In the beginning, on the left-hand side, the mechanical energy that people used was their own muscle, and they used their own muscle to farm and to hunt. And the thermal energy, the heat, was fire fueled by biomass, by wood, and it allowed people to exist. It was a subsistence lifestyle. But through time, people wanted to do better, so they learned how to expand their sources of energy. And at first, it was just enlisting additional muscle, either by domesticating animals and using animal muscle, or maybe not quite so nobly, capturing and enslaving people, and using other people's muscle to assist their muscle. Eventually, began to learn how to harness mechanical energy from other sources, first from wind and water. Sailing vessels probably came first, and windmills later. And eventually, as the Industrial Revolution began, learning to harness hydraulic energy to power the early machines of the Industrial Revolution. So dam up a waterway, put in a water wheel, and turn some kind of a mill or a machine. At the same time, with thermal energy, particularly in Europe, or first in Europe, the more wood people burned, the scarcer it became, and soon coal was discovered as an acceptable or an abundant substitute for wood. So particularly first in England and then in continental Europe, coal began to supplant wood as a primary source of thermal energy, and water was the primary source of mechanical energy. Big breakthrough in 1776 was, obviously the independence of the United States, but also the invention of the steam engine. And the steam engine allowed, this was James Watt's steam engine, 1776, allowed conversion of heat energy, thermal energy, to mechanical energy, and overcame the limitations of limited places and limited amounts of water that could be dammed for hydraulic energy. And then we were really off to the races on industry. We could burn coal, turn steam engines, and allow much more work to be done than could be done simply with water. At the same time, folks were looking for alternative sources for fuel for illumination. Up until the mid-19th century, really the alternatives were either candlelight or whale oil. Candlelight was dirty, whale oil was becoming scarce, and eventually it was discovered that petroleum, naturally occurring oil, could be refined into an illumination fuel, which was kerosene. That was really the beginning of the oil industry. Some of the waste products, actually the byproducts of refining oil to kerosene, were things like gasoline and distillate, which is diesel fuel. People quickly learned how to, or soon you learned how to use these in internal combustion engines, and they became dominant transportation fuels. And all three of the main fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, were used through time to generate electricity, and electricity then became another large use of fossil fuels and a large source of energy for the world. Time for another poll, and this is more of a trivia question, but which Ivy League institution do you think factored most prominently in the birth of the oil industry in the 19th century? And I put them all up there, so you're going to have to guess. Okay, do we have the results, Kate?
Looks like most people think it's the University of Pennsylvania. Perhaps not surprising, since that's where the oil.
Absolutely, that's a very logical answer. However, it's not exactly correct, but it's okay. It actually all began with two other Ivy League institutions, but Dartmouth alum was actually the father of the modern oil industry. George Bissell, Dartmouth class of 1945, born and raised in Hanover, went to Dartmouth, went to New York, I think it was, to become an attorney, came back to Hanover in the mid-1850s, visited an old professor of his and saw a jar of something called Pennsylvania rock oil sitting on the professor's shelf. And he got curious about it because he had heard, or he knew, that there were ways to refine an illumination fuel out of coal. And he was kind of curious to see if you could do the same with this Pennsylvania rock oil. So he sent a sample of it to a Dr. Benjamin Silliman at Yale. So that would have been the other second correct answer. And surely enough, the analysis demonstrated that it was quite feasible to refine this crude oil into a lamp oil product, which they called kerosene. And then Bissell basically bought some land in Pennsylvania, formed an exploration company to test the feasibility of actually drilling wells to produce oil. People were drilling wells to produce water. He wondered, well, why can't you drill a well to produce oil? His company brought in Colonel Edwin Drake, who was responsible for drilling the first successful well in Pennsylvania. And really the rest is history. Bissell became an entrepreneur in Pennsylvania and started not just oil companies, but a lot of the other supporting companies that were needed to support the early oil industry. He died in 1884, and he's actually buried in the cemetery on the Dartmouth campus. So if you're on campus, you can actually go visit his grave. I found that whole story pretty fascinating. That's how it all began. And this is sort of a chart showing the progression of energy consumption in the United States, which really mirrors the global uptake of fossil fuels. Different countries starting at different times. England started using coal somewhat before the United States. United States and Western Europe pretty much adopted petroleum, natural gas in the same sorts of time frame. But really what it tells is a story of new inventions through time for improving, life at home, at work, and travel, in parallel with new technologies and new explorations and discoveries in fossil fuels. So, starting in the sort of just before the Civil War, the advent of steam locomotives and steam engines in industrial facilities in the United States, primarily consuming coal, with the discovery of the possibility of refining oil into kerosene, kerosene for illumination. Industrial coal really took off after the Civil War. Towards the end of the 19th century, urban electrification to power electric illumination. The invention of the Model T brought in, the use of personal cars fueled by gasoline. Just before the Second World War, really in the 1930s, commercial aviation became a thing. And during the Depression, under the auspices of the Roosevelt administration, rural electrification. World War II was an enormous consumer of fossil fuels. In the post-war period, we had the construction of the interstate highway system, the introduction of the jet age. By 1970, 50% of the homes in the U.S. were air conditioned, and now I think the number is closer to 90%. So you can see the rise in consumption, first of coal, second of oil, and then third of natural gas, continuing really right up to the present. And all the while, the standard of living and lifestyle was increasing. So was the population of the country. So you see massive population growth through the 20th century to, today we're at, I don't know what, 340, 350 million in the United States. So that's kind of the history of in a nutshell, of what's driven the growth in fossil fuel use. And you can see at the bottom here, wood, which is this line here, was the primary fuel in the 1800s and is now, a very minor one. So just another question, and we're not going to do a poll on this one, but just think to yourself as an individual or as a household, how much fossil fuel, oil, gas, and coal do you personally consume in a year? How much of that global use are you responsible for? And if you want, you can jot a number in the text or in the chat, or just write it down, and we'll take a look in a minute at sort of typical hydrocarbon use.
And John, you're thinking not just fuels that people may purchase directly and consume directly, but also fuels that people
I'm thinking everything that you're responsible for, everything you're accountable for, responsible for, in terms of everything you do, everything you consume, all the energy, all the fossil fuel that goes into making it, producing it, delivering it to you, whatever.
Yeah, so that would be like your electricity consumption. And are you also thinking embodied energy and products that people
everything
buy?
Yeah, everything.
Everything. Awesome.
So okay, short answer is I don't know how much you use, but the average American household, you may or may not be average, consumes about 4,000 gallons of oil equivalent, that's the oil and natural gas together, plus about 5.7 tons of coal. And the way I got to those numbers is simply dividing the amount that's consumed in the United States by the number of households, and that's roughly what you're responsible for. Based on domestic consumption, you really should increase these amounts by about 20% to include the fossil fuels embodied in the things that we import. So it's probably a little bit bigger number than that. And then consumption increases with household income. So if your household happens to be in the top 20% of in terms of household income, which last year would have been a household income greater than 120,000, you consume about 44% more than the national average. So putting that in real terms, if you put the coal in one of those dump trucks, like on the lower left, you'd be consuming 1 or 2 dump trucks worth of coal in a year. And that's a 4,000 gallon tank there. So you'd be consuming 1 or 2 of those, depending on whether you're average or above average in terms of your consumption. So, I don't know what each individual actually consume, but on average, that's what Americans would consume. So to put it in simple terms, you'd need a dump truck pulling a trailer like that once or twice a year to meet your fuel needs. Let me talk a little bit about the oil and gas industry and how it's put together. We typically divide the oil and gas industry into 3 sectors, and this is really, it has to do with the evolution and specialization of the industry over the years, but it's really not very different from how it started. We talk about the upstream, or the exploration and production side. This is the part of the industry that drills for, develops, and produces crude oil and natural gas. So the oil fields themselves, the wells, the pumps, the production facilities, and the tanks where they're stored in the fields. There's then a midstream sector, which basically collects the oil from the oil fields, perhaps does some minimal processing, and then transports natural gas and oil, mostly by pipeline, from the oil fields to the places where they're refined, and in the case of natural gas, to the places where they're distributed and consumed. And then the downstream industry, which is basically responsible for refining the crude oil into finished products like gasoline, kerosene, jet fuel, and so on. And also the distribution and sale of those products, both wholesale and retail, and the production of petrochemicals, which are used as feedstock for other manufacturing. And then the industry itself, there are companies that specialize in each of these individual segments. There are independent exploration and production companies, names like Chesapeake and Oxy and Devon and Apache, who participate really only in the upstream sector. There are companies that participate only in the midstream sector, people like TransCanada, Williams, Kinder Morgan, who mainly transport oil and gas. And then there are refiners like Valero and Irving who really just do refining, distribution, and marketing of products. Then there are also integrated oil and gas companies, the big ones that do all three of these things, companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, and BP, publicly traded companies in the private sector, and then national oil companies that are state-owned, like Saudi Aramco in Saudi Arabia, Petrobras in Brazil. And the entire industry is supported by a number of technology and service companies that are contract support to do a lot of the day-to-day things that the oil companies do. So if you think about it too, the characteristics of these three sectors of the industry are somewhat different. The upstream business is a somewhat riskier, very capital intensive business where large investments can be made before any revenue is generated. The midstream, frankly, operates kind of like a toll road. A lot of it operates in a regulated environment where they're basically paid a tariff for carrying product through their pipeline, a very reliable source of income, but a relatively modest returns to their investors. And then the downstream, which is really like a manufacturing and enterprise that makes a bunch of product and sells it to a bunch of people. Hydrocarbons, oil and gas are transported in different ways. The liquids can be transported by truck, by rail, or by pipeline. This is a map of the major pipelines in the US, and you can see they're colored different ways. The orange ones are ones that transport crude oil from oil fields to refineries. And there's a big hub in Oklahoma at Cushing where a number of these meet and then branch out to distribute things to refineries along the Gulf Coast and the East Coast. The refined products then are transported in the purple lines to get closer to the points of use, and then they're generally distributed from terminals by trucks to retail sites. Natural gas is a little bit different. There really isn't, you can't transport natural gas very easily in a truck, so it's transported by pipeline throughout entire continents. You can see the red pipelines in North America that provide a network almost like a power grid to carry natural gas from where it's produced to where it's consumed, and similar in Europe and Asia, where gas that's produced in Russia and Norway is transported into Western Europe for consumption. I was astounded to learn that, not including the distribution pipes in cities in the US, just what's needed to collect the natural gas from natural gas fields and transport it to public utilities where it's distributed, or power plants where it's consumed. There are 3 million miles of natural gas pipelines in the United States alone, versus about 2.3 million miles of paved roads. So it's an incredible amount of infrastructure. And in recent years, the natural gas trade has really become global, and liquefaction of natural gas has allowed it to be put in ships and transported across oceans and globally. This started really in the 1960s to get natural gas into Europe from Africa primarily. In the 1970s, the trade grew as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan were looking for alternatives to oil from OPEC to generate electric power. And now about 40 countries in the world receive LNG, liquefied natural gas, from about 17 countries that export it. And the United States is now one of the exporters of liquefied natural gas to the world.
John, we do have a few questions. Can I hop in and ask them now?
Yeah, sure. Great time to ask.
Great. So Henry asks, how do government subsidies drive fossil fuel usage in the US? One hears that these are big drivers, but Henry doesn't know if that's reality.
Yeah, so and I'm not an expert on subsidies, but I have seen a lot of the statements about subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. What I would say that in general is that subsidies to the fossil fuel industry are very similar to subsidies to any other industry. In other words, any business uh, is able to deduct its costs and investments from its revenue on its taxes. And a lot of what people cite as subsidies to the oil and gas industry are simply that the oil and gas industry deducts its costs from its expenses to calculate its income and its tax on its income. And because the oil and gas industry generates many, many, many times more revenue than today than the renewable energy industry does, it receives more credit for costs than the renewable energy industry does. Other sorts of things that are cited as subsidies. I mean, there has historically been government-sponsored research and development in national laboratories and academic institutions directed towards fossil fuel development and production. Those have generally been during times when there was a strategic imperative for the United States to either develop more energy resources or develop new and different ways to recover them. And then, a lot of oil and gas is produced from federal lands and government-owned lands, and the producers of those pay royalties to the government. I think there are folks that believe that those royalties are less than they would be paying on private land. So I think that's one of the things that's often cited. The midstream oil and gas industry has the right of eminent domain, so they can condemn land and compensate the owners for it. So they do get government assistance in acquiring right of way for pipelines in a way that's not much different than, for instance, how an electric power company can exercise eminent domain to install power transmission lines. So there are some. So certainly, yes, you can say that you could call those subsidies. In general, they're not tremendously different from the kinds of subsidies that other industries receive. If you take them by themselves, though, and look at the numbers, there's some stunningly large numbers because it's a stunningly large industry.
Awesome. So we have a few questions in the chat. John, I'm just going to give you one more before we move on. And maybe this will be a question for now, and maybe you'll want to save this for when you do the sort of comparative look at where countries are standing across the globe at the end.
Okay.
But Katya wants to know whether certain countries like Russia, for instance, are able to hold power over other countries like Ukraine.
Yeah, we're going to talk. We'll talk about exactly that one later, because I think that's a great question.
Awesome. Well, I guess we'll move on, and I might be able to pull some of these questions later on. I do want to be cognizant of time.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about globally what's going on today. So I'm going to talk individually through the three main fossil fuels. First, coal. And the map on the lower left, the black blobs are the main coal-producing regions of the world. Some are a little hard to see, but those are the main coal-producing regions of the world. China today is by far both the largest producer and consumer of coal in the world. That's the consumption graph on the top and the production graph on the bottom, and the red bar at the top of both is China. India is also a large coal consumer, and they're a large importer because their domestic production isn't terribly high. And the rest of the world consumes some coal. United States consumes some for power generation. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, the large steel producing countries, consume a significant amount of coal in the production of steel. And then the countries for whom coal is an important export, so an important part of their economy, the three largest are Indonesia, Australia, and Russia. And they are mostly exporting to the Southeast Asian countries, a little bit to China and to Europe. Oil, no big surprise. United States is both the largest producer and consumer of oil. So the United States is the largest producer of oil in the world. We're also the largest consumer of oil in the world. The largest principal exporters of oil in the world are the countries in the Middle East, around the Persian Gulf, Russia, and West Africa. So West Africa, and the main importers, the largest importing regions are Europe and Asia. So other than Norway, there's very little oil production in Europe. So most of the oil that's consumed in Europe today is imported from the Middle East and Russia. In terms of who has the most oil today, Iran, Iraq, and Venezuela. This map down below, the countries are sized in terms of their oil reserves, so what's remaining in the ground. The graph on the right is sized in terms of production. So the largest producers today are the United States, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Canada. But the countries with the most in the ground today are Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and the countries around the Persian Gulf. Iran, Iraq, and Venezuela are particularly interesting because they have vast reserves of oil in the ground, but lag considerably in production, mainly because of recent political events over the last couple of decades in those countries. These countries are sized in terms of billion barrels, so 300 billion barrels of reserves in Venezuela. I think the world consumes, about 100 billion barrels a day. So what would that be? About 30 or 40 billion barrels a year of oil today. And then natural gas, again, United States, once again, both the largest consumer and the largest producer of natural gas. The United States does on net export natural gas, both by pipeline to Mexico and now as liquefied natural gas. The two largest exporting countries in the world are Qatar and Russia. Natural gas was once considered sort of a waste product in the whole hydrocarbon chain, where it was often just flared or vented. But now it's become the fossil fuel of choice for electric power generation, both because it's flexible. A gas-fired power plant can be turned on and off very easily, very quickly. So it's a great complement to other interruptible sources. And also its carbon footprint is considerably lower than coal. China, Japan, and Korea rely heavily on imports of liquefied natural gas from the Middle East, Russia, and Australia. So, and then Europe relies both on pipeline imports from Russia and from Norway, but increasingly turning to liquefied natural gas as an alternative. And it's exactly around that desire to not be completely dependent on Russia as its dominant source of supply, because Russia has used and has threatened to use their natural gas and oil as a tool, let's say, as a tool of economic diplomacy against other countries, the Ukraine being one, and Western Europe being the other. So in balance, in terms of fossil fuels, there are positives and negatives. Clearly, the positives are it is abundant, it's scalable, it's shown its ability to grow to meet demand. It's relatively inexpensive compared to most other sources. The energy density is high. It's very flexible. It's transportable. It's dispatchable. Its use isn't dependent on the time of day or the time of year. And the markets and the infrastructure are very well developed. Of course, the other side of oil and gas, there are challenges with worker health and safety, especially in coal mining. industrial pollution of air and water and soil in the places where it's produced and refined, and the emissions from combustion, the nitrous oxides, sulfurs, particulates, and other things. Hazards associated with transportation by sea and by land, land and water use associated with the production. And then the big one is obviously greenhouse gas emissions. The first five can be managed to a large extent just by how companies conduct their business. The last one is just an inherent feature of fossil fuels. When you burn fossil fuels, you produce carbon dioxide, and absent any mitigation of that carbon dioxide, it's just a fact of fossil fuels. So that's really the probably the big ones. I mentioned earlier just relative impact, greenhouse gas impact of various fuels. I'm not going to dwell on this one, but what I wanted to show you here, the chart on the left is just the relative emissions, direct emissions from combustion of wood, coal, diesel, ethanol, propane, and natural gas, where you can see the combustion emissions from natural gas per unit of heat produced is about roughly half of that for coal. The other thing about natural gas is that the power generation systems using natural gas are significantly more efficient. So when you combine the combustion emissions with the efficiency factor, modern combined cycle natural gas plant yields about 1/3 the greenhouse gas emissions as a coal-fired plant. And that's why, over the last decade or so, there's been such a push to replace coal-fired power generation with natural gas-fired power generation. For quite a while, it was viewed as sort of a bridge fuel to a world of lower carbon energy, and largely responsible, honestly, for the fact that greenhouse gas emissions in the United States have been flat to falling for the last 15 or 20 years. It's purely fuel substitution, or almost purely fuel substitution on the fossil fuel side. I'm going to skip this one. So when you think about the fossil fuel problem or challenge in general, putting it in perspective of how dependent the world is on fossil fuels today, first of all, there are about 1.4 billion motor vehicles in the world. That's like one for every 5 people in the world today. 1 billion of those are passenger cars, the rest are commercial vehicles, and 98% or more than 98% of those burn fossil fuels. In terms of farming, I didn't have an exact number, but I tried to back one out. There are about 50 million tractors fueled by fossil fuels engaged in farming worldwide. 39,000 commercial aircraft carrying over 4 billion passengers a year, along with cargo, and those all burn fossil fuels. Marine cargo is carried by about 53,000 merchant ships, almost all of which burn fossil fuels. More than 60% of the world's electricity is generated using fossil fuels. Almost half the world's population depends on crop yields supported by nitrogen fertilizers, which are produced from natural gas. And if you add all this up together and look at the flip side of it, the non-fossil fuel sources in use today, which currently support about 20% of global primary energy demand, provide about the amount of total energy that the world used in the early 1950s. And in the early 1950s, the population was about 1/3 of what it is today. So if you look at that consumption on a per capita basis, really the non-fossil fuels in use today, that 20% of primary energy supply would support today's global population at about the per capita level of world demand in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So in replacing or thinking about replacing some, most, or all of that 80% of primary energy supply that's currently provided by fossil fuels, the challenge is immense, which is why at this point, we're going to throw it back to you and head to the breakout rooms. We're going to have to be pretty quick in the breakout rooms, probably take about 5 minutes in the breakouts, and just discuss quickly what you think you can do yourself or influence others to do in the community where you live to significantly reduce the use of fossil fuels. So just to quickly wrap up the breakout, we don't probably have a lot of time to share back, but if you have time, just drop in the chat, a list of what you individually came up with, or what you came up with in your group discussions, and then we're going to move on and talk about how different countries in different parts of the world are wrestling with the same topic. Is how do you navigate an energy transition? So let me move to the next slide. And really, it's what we've been saying all along in Energy 101. Where you sit determines where you stand. So, resource-rich exporters of oil and gas, like, Saudi Arabia, Russian Federation, Canada, Australia, probably look at it in one way. They have a valuable resource and significant source of employment and national income for their countries. The importers on the other side, Europe imports almost all their fossil fuels from other places. Japan, China produces some, but imports a lot. India, South Korea, the net importers look at it in a different way. They may see an energy transition, for instance, as an opportunity to gain more energy independence. There are exporters with declining resources, like Norway, that's exporting oil and gas has been a big part of their economy in the past. They expect it to be significant but diminishing in the future. You have some countries that are emerging producers, countries that are new to the production and exporting side, like Israel, Guyana and Suriname in South America, Mozambique in East Africa. These are countries that have newfound resources. And then you have the large economies like the United States and Brazil that have struggled in recent years to reach a point where they're energy independent and roughly in supply-demand balance, and even becoming exporters. So sitting on both sides, large consumers and large producers. So each of these, just as each of you, has different concerns and considerations. And it's very interesting to see how it's playing out globally today. And I'll just kind of touch on a few hotspots. Russia's concerns are mainly that their oil and gas industry is what revived the Russian economy in the last 10 years or so. And their national economy is heavily dependent on revenue from exports of pipeline gas to Europe. The rise of exports from other places by liquefied natural gas to Europe is a threat to the Russian economy, and they behave accordingly. Europe, on the other hand, has had to significantly increase their fossil fuel imports in the last 10 years or so. A combination of sort of a leave it in the ground mindset with their own resources, honestly, partly fueled by Russian influence in Europe on how people are thinking, but also local concern over environmental side. And the renewables haven't filled the void yet in Europe, so they continue to increase slightly their fossil fuel importing. They're highly dependent on energy from outside Europe. Middle East, those countries have large endowments of low-cost oil and gas that are the main sources of income for entire nations. So they, along with the large international oil companies, are actively pursuing ways to decarbonize the oil and gas value chain, while they also look at investments forward into renewables. China is very interesting. China is working very hard to secure supplies of gas, oil, and coal imports to fuel their economy today, while they're also seeking to become the leading global supplier of photovoltaics and battery technology to the world in the future. And I find it very interesting, just in the last few weeks, they've cited their strategic aim to be, I think, net zero by 2060, which is about 10 years after the rest of the world. So I'm wondering if what they're really trying to do is use gas, oil, and coal to ramp up their manufacturing industry and first export their photovoltaics and batteries before they begin using them domestically, and just take advantage of the trade opportunities of the rest of the world moving to renewables, um, and set their net zero target just a little bit later. Africa is very much a tale of two Africas. They're the haves and the have-nots, the oil producing nations in Africa, Nigeria, Angola, Algeria, and the like, and the have-nots, the sub-Saharan African countries that are just living in abject poverty and abject energy poverty. And then I think in the US, we're really kind of, as a country, torn between, our newfound energy self-sufficiency and the economic and honestly, the security benefits that's brought us. The United States is much less dependent on foreign fossil fuels. In fact, we aren't really dependent at all on foreign fossil fuels compared to where we were just a decade ago. So that against sort of the global stewardship and altruism associated with decarbonizing greenhouse gases and global climate. And then within the US, there are regional interests. There's a big difference between attitudes in a state like Texas, that's the largest oil producer in the country, or Pennsylvania, that's one of the largest natural gas producers in the country, and states like New York, California, Florida, other consuming states. So it's really, really interesting to see how things are playing out in the world. So how's the next transition going to occur? I don't actually know. In the past, it's really been driven by technology and market forces, and those transitions have been relatively slow. The transition from, into and the rise of coal and of oil and of natural gas have been things that have taken 50 to 100 years. Or will it be accelerated by government policy that's directed at the climate crisis? Is it going to be driven by politicians and regulators? Is it going to be driven by government policy? Or is it going to be driven, as we're seeing today, as much by investors and consumers and what their desires are? Is it going to happen by global consensus? I mean, we've got the Paris Agreement, but the commitments under that are a bit squishy. And relatively few are meeting even the squishy targets that they set. So is it going to happen by global consensus or not? And then finally, what's the role of fossil fuel going to be during the transition and after the transition? So those are all questions that I don't have answers for, but I think they're just great fuel for thought as long as we're talking about fuel. We'll make these slides available to everybody, but some great sources of data if you want to track down these things yourselves. The one on the bottom I found a while back. It's called Our World in Data, and it's an interactive tool where you can pull in data from all kinds of other places, and it's not just energy data, it's all sorts of things, interactive plotting and stuff like that. It's great. You probably noticed a lot of the charts in my presentation came from there. And then some great books. Daniel Yergin, he's a fossil fuel guy, so don't expect anything else from him. But 3 great books that sort of tell the story of the rise of oil, energy security, and his latest one, The New Map, is talking about energy and climate and some of the geopolitics associated with that. Switch, which is out of a group out of Austin in Texas that talks about energy transition, the future of energy and energy poverty. And then the one I like down on the bottom right is a book by Carl Bergstrom and Jevin West. And it's Calling Bullshit. And it's a great book. And they also have an online course you can take on how to understand when people are using data objectively and when they are using it, what should I say, twisting facts to in agenda-driven advocacy. So I strongly recommend that as well. And with that, I will leave it. And as I promised at the beginning, I know we've run a little bit long now, but I will stay as long as folks want to if you want to stay and ask questions or discuss anything. I'm here for as long as you want me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. And we will be will be ending in just a moment. I just want to let everyone know that in the next session, we're going to do sort of the flip side of the coin. And we're going to hear from Stephen Doig in the Irving Institute about opportunities and challenges of renewable energy. So this should tie really well into what John discussed today, trying to figure out how we actually can cut down that 80% of global primary energy coming from fossil fuels and increase renewable generation. And just a quick note is that we have a few events that are coming up tomorrow, Tuesday, next Wednesday, and the Tuesday after, both deck lunch talks and this new energy conversations with early career researchers. So if you're interested in any of those, go check those out on our website. But yeah, just to wrap up, thank you so much for your talk tonight, John, and you will be staying a few minutes if folks want to stick around and ask questions that they weren't able to get answered earlier. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and we'll see you next week.